When you think of the Cold War, what comes to mind? The era evokes thoughts of nuclear standoffs, of espionage, and of proxy wars and insurgencies fought across various locales around the world. But there's an aspect of Cold War America that helped shape the world we live in today, and it's one that doesn't involve missiles or soldiers or fighting, at least not directly. It's an aspect centered on massive societal programs aimed at uplifting and improving the lives of all Americans. I'm your host David, and today we are looking at Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, a sweeping domestic reform agenda that wasn't just about improving American life, but also about winning the ideological battle with communism. This is the Cold War. Okay, so LBJ believed that if the United States was going to claim superiority over the Soviet Union, it couldn't just build bigger bombs. It had to prove that democracy and capitalism could create a just society for all its citizens, regardless of race, income, or background. A society where no child will go unfed and no youngster will go unschooled. This story today begins with the 1964 election, where Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, who had taken over the presidency after JFK's assassination, faced off against Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. In his famous acceptance speech for the Republican nomination, Goldwater had dropped this bombshell quote: "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." This didn't exactly calm fears that Goldwater, with his far-right rhetoric, might push the world towards nuclear disaster. Enter the Daisy ad. Officially titled "Peace, Little Girl," the ad showed a young girl picking petals off a flower, innocently counting. Suddenly, the scene cuts to a countdown, followed by the explosion of a nuclear bomb. The message was clear. A vote for Goldwater was a vote for nuclear Armageddon. The 60-second ad aired only once on September 7, 1964, but it has become iconic. Johnson's strategy worked. He crushed Goldwater in the general election, winning 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. With a mandate of his own and a Democratic supermajority in Congress, LBJ had the political capital to launch his most ambitious domestic agenda, the Great Society. So, what was the Great Society? Well, think of it as an extension of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, but with the added pressure of Cold War optics. Johnson's vision wasn't just about reducing poverty or improving education. It was a sweeping and ambitious dream to improve life in America. Johnson wanted to create a society where every American had the opportunity to succeed and where racial inequality was eradicated. Johnson himself described the Great Society in detail in a speech he gave in 1964. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time. But that is just the beginning. The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where leisure is a welcome chance to build and reflect, not a feared cause of boredom and restlessness. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where man can renew contact with nature. It is a place which honors creation for its own sake and for what it adds to the understanding of race. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods. But most of all, the Great Society is not a safe harbor, a resting place, a final objective of finished work. It is a challenge, constantly renewed, beckoning us towards a destiny where the meaning of our lives matches the marvelous products of our labor. So I want to talk to you today about 3 places where we begin to build the Great Society: in our cities, in our countryside, and in our classrooms. It's a fairly long quote, but illustrates the loftiness of LBJ's aims for America. But let's be real, this wasn't just about being nice or improving the lives of just Americans. It was also about the international perception of America. Keep in mind that the Cold War loomed large in the background, an ever-present framework against which every action was measured. If the United States was going to prove that democracy and capitalism were superior to communism, it had to show the world it could solve its own problems. Poverty, racism, and lack of access to education were glaring issues that communists pointed to as evidence that the US system didn't work. Johnson believed that if the US could fix these issues, it would strengthen its position in the Cold War. This was a battle for hearts and minds, one being fought on the domestic front. Now, one of the cornerstone pieces of the Great Society was the War on Poverty. Officially launched in 1964, this initiative aimed to tackle poverty in all its forms: hunger, unemployment, illiteracy, and so on. It aimed to help Americans by providing both resources and opportunities to improve their lives. Johnson believed that the solution to poverty wasn't just handing out aid, but equipping people with the tools to help themselves. Give a person a fish versus teaching them to fish, right? The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was the backbone of this effort. It created programs like Head Start, which offered early childhood education to disadvantaged kids. It also established Job Corps, which provided job training to young adults, and VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, which sent volunteers into impoverished communities to help alleviate social issues. VISTA has often been referred to as a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Keep in mind that these programs weren't just about uplifting individuals. They were also about sending a message to the world. And that message was clear: capitalism could provide opportunities, and poverty wasn't inevitable. The war on poverty was, in part, a Cold War tactic aimed at undermining the Soviet critique that capitalism exploited the poor. And it had an impact, at least initially anyways. From 1963 to 1970, the percentage of Americans living below the poverty line dropped from 22.2% to 12.6%, a drop of 9.6% in just 7 years, the most dramatic decline over such a short period in US history. And don't think that the Great Society's war on poverty was just about helping inner-city populations, because it wasn't. It extended into remote areas like Appalachia, one of the poorest regions in the United States. On April 24, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson arrived in Inez, Kentucky, turning the rural landscape of Appalachia into a backdrop for his War on Poverty campaign. With the White House press corps in tow, the visit was carefully orchestrated to show the American public the harsh realities of life in eastern Kentucky's Martin County, where 70% of residents lived in poverty. Johnson walked the backcountry roads and visited families. This included Tommy Fletcher, an unemployed coal miner, husband, and father of 8, who had earned only $400 the previous year. In a photograph by Walter Bennett, now iconic for its portrayal of poverty, Fletcher, standing on his front porch with his sons, shared his struggles with the president. The image captured the stark reality Johnson wanted to highlight as he made his case to the American public. Facing the cameras, he delivered his sweeping message: "I have called for a national war on poverty. Our objective? Total victory." The trip was more than a campaign stop. It was a calculated photo op designed to make Appalachia the symbol of a national crisis. The Appalachian Regional Development Act of 1965 was designed to address this by investing in infrastructure, healthcare, and education in the region. In theory, the act aimed to uplift entire communities through government intervention. In practice, the results were mixed. While some areas saw improved access to healthcare and education, poverty remained high in many parts of Appalachia. But the Great Society wasn't just about social welfare. Johnson tied his domestic agenda to America's Cold War competition in science and technology. This was the time period when the space race was in full swing, and Johnson saw education as the key to beating the Soviets to the moon and beyond. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 wasn't just about fixing underfunded schools in poor areas. That was a direct part, sure, but it was also very much about keeping up with the Soviets. LBJ's administration poured federal funding into STEM programs, ensuring that America's next generation of scientists and engineers would be able to compete with their Soviet counterparts. Johnson knew that if the US was going to win the Cold War, or at least not lose it, it needed the brainpower to out-innovate its rivals. So this wasn't just domestic policy, it was a strategic move in the global battle for technological supremacy. Another critical piece of the Great Society was healthcare reform. Medicare and Medicaid, which were both signed into law in 1965, were designed to provide healthcare to the elderly and the poor, two groups that had been largely left out of the post-war economic boom. Medicare offered health insurance to those over 65, while Medicaid provided free healthcare for low-income individuals and families. Access to healthcare was seen as a key step to a society where everyone could have the opportunity to thrive despite circumstances. Now, at the very heart of Johnson's Great Society was the fight to end racial injustice. This was most clearly seen in his push for civil rights legislation, which culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws sought to dismantle institutional racism by banning segregation, prohibiting employment discrimination, and enforcing voting rights for African Americans. But, and this is the part that I keep repeating, it wasn't just about domestic justice. It was about global perception. The US was trying to sell itself as the land of the free, but images of police attacking peaceful civil rights protesters were being broadcast around the world. Soviet propaganda gleefully used American racism as proof that democracy had failed. Johnson understood that passing civil rights legislation wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was also about improving America's image on the global stage. And now, back to the policies. Johnson's vision of the Great Society didn't stop at poverty and civil rights. He also prioritized environmental protection, immigration reform, and urban renewal. In 1965, Johnson signed the Water Quality Act and the Highway Beautification Act, the latter championed by his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. Lady Bird believed that a more beautiful America would help create a more harmonious one. To quote her, quote, "Ugliness is so grim, a little beauty, something that is lovely, I think, can help create harmony, which will lessen tensions." That same year, Johnson also signed the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which eliminated the racist national quotas from the 1920s, opening the door for more immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This reform was not only a clear repudiation of the isolationism and xenophobia that had long shaped US immigration policy, almost since the birth of the Republic in fact, but helped align immigration policy to the equalities supposed in the successes of the civil rights movement. On the urban front, the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, was aimed at tackling affordable housing and urban renewal. Robert Weaver, appointed by Johnson to lead HUD, became the first African American cabinet member. The goal was to help rebuild American cities, many of which had been suffering from poverty and neglect as populations shifted from city centers to the suburbs. Another key part of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society was promoting public education and the arts and humanities. These efforts were designed not only to enrich American culture, but also to strengthen the country's global image during the Cold War, showcasing democracy's ability to foster creativity and intellectual freedom. To this end, in 1965, Johnson signed the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act, which created the NEA and the NEH, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, respectively. The idea of federally supporting the arts had been brewing since the Kennedy administration, and a report in 1964 warned that the focus on science, driven by the Cold War, was putting the humanities at risk. By establishing these agencies, Johnson aimed to support the arts and humanities as essential elements of American culture and society. And like much of the rest of the Great Society program, this wasn't just about domestic cultural growth. It was a Cold War tactic. The US wanted to showcase the richness of its free society in contrast to the more restrictive Soviet regime, using the arts and humanities to highlight the cultural superiority of democracy. In 1967, Johnson further advanced the Great Society by signing the Public Broadcasting Act, which led to the creation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The CPB established PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, in 1969 and later helped form NPR, National Public Radio. These outlets provided educational and cultural programming, including iconic children's shows like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And the push for public broadcasting wasn't just about education. It was also a way to demonstrate the openness and creativity of American society to the world. While Soviet media was controlled and used for direct propaganda, American public broadcasting was a tool for education and cultural growth, reflecting the values of democracy. Through these efforts, Johnson's Great Society emphasized that arts, education, and media were as important as economic and political reforms in showing the world that the US could lead not just in science and industry, but also in cultural and intellectual life. The Great Society was as much a response to the pressures of the Cold War as it was an effort to address pressing domestic issues. Johnson saw this plan as a way to strengthen America's global position in its ideological battle with the Soviet Union. At its core, the Great Society aimed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice, but these initiatives were also carefully crafted to serve as a global showcase of the strength and superiority of the American capitalist system. In the ideological battle with the Soviet Union, the US needed to demonstrate that democracy and capitalism could deliver economic security, social equality, and justice for all citizens, something communism claimed to do through centralized government. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and the War on Poverty were designed not only to uplift marginalized Americans, but also to counter Soviet propaganda that portrayed the US as a nation plagued by inequality and systemic failures. Even programs like the Highway Beautification Act served this overall public relations goal. After all, how could America claim to be the shining city on a hill if its rivers were polluted and its highways lined with billboards? Johnson recognized that the global perception of American democracy was crucial in the Cold War, and by addressing domestic challenges like poverty and civil rights, he sought to strengthen America's standing as the leader of the free world. In this way, the Great Society was a domestic initiative with significant international implications aimed at winning hearts and minds in both the US and abroad. As ambitious as the Great Society was, it faced significant challenges, and the biggest, the war in Vietnam. As US involvement in Vietnam escalated, Johnson found himself in a bind. The war was expensive, both in terms of lives and dollars, and it sapped the resources Johnson had hoped to use for his domestic programs. By 1966, just a year after the launch of the Great Society, Johnson was already scaling back his ambitions. The war effort demanded more and more money, and as anti-war protests grew, so did the political backlash. Conservatives attacked the Great Society as government overreach, while liberals argued it didn't go far enough. Now, LBJ was known as the Master of the Senate, a moniker he earned for a reason. He had a reputation for being able to twist arms, cut deals, browbeat, and intimidate like no one else. As an aside, some of his tactics while trying to get what he wanted included swimming in the nude in front of subordinates and even pooping with the door open without dismissing people in order to show his dominance. But his ability to work with Congress and cut deals was a key factor in getting the Great Society off the ground. Johnson's Democratic majority in Congress certainly helped. But it wasn't smooth sailing all the way. He faced opposition not only from Republicans, but also from more conservative Democrats, particularly those from the South, who balked at the civil rights components of the Great Society. One of Johnson's biggest allies in the Senate was Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, who worked tirelessly to keep the Democratic caucus together. But even with such allies, the Vietnam War made it harder for Johnson to keep the momentum going. By the time the 1966 midterms rolled around, Republicans were making significant gains, limiting Johnson's ability to pass new legislation. Now, we should talk a bit about how the Great Society was being perceived. The media, as you would expect, played a crucial role in shaping how Americans, and the world really, viewed the Great Society. News outlets like the New York Times covered Johnson's social programs extensively, framing them as the next logical step in America's post-war development. Television, which was still a relatively new medium, became a powerful tool in selling the vision of a more equitable America. But not everyone was convinced. Conservative outlets like National Review slammed the Great Society as government overreach, fueling fears that Johnson's programs would turn the US into a socialist state. The Cold War was as much about controlling narratives as it was about controlling territory, and the media was right at the center of that fight. Johnson's programs, for all their domestic focus, were also about projecting an image of American strength and fairness to the rest of the world. So, as we begin to bring this episode to a close, it's important to consider what the legacy of these programs has been. When Johnson signed the Great Society programs into law, he hoped to reshape American society for generations to come. And in many ways, he succeeded. At the time of writing, Medicare and Medicaid are still in place, providing healthcare to millions of Americans. The Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act fundamentally altered the political landscape, particularly in the South. But the long-term effects go beyond just policy. The Great Society shifted the national conversation about the role of government. For many Americans, Johnson's programs became a symbol of government overreach, setting the stage for the conservative backlash of the Reagan era. Yet, for others, these programs became the foundation of the modern welfare state, a testament to what the government can achieve when it focuses on helping people. The Great Society didn't just change policy, it changed how Americans viewed their relationship with the state, and that change is still being felt today. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is pooping with the door open to make other bell buttons so uncomfortable that they agree to whatever it is that they want, just so that they can leave. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.